There is a bedroom in Philadelphia in 1887, on the second floor of a respectable house, with the curtains drawn at 2 in the afternoon. A woman is lying in the bed. She has been lying in it for 5 weeks. She is not permitted to sit up without assistance. She is not permitted to read. She is not permitted to write, to sew, to draw, or to hold a conversation of any substantial length. She is fed by a nurse, washed by a nurse, and turned in the bed by a nurse. Her doctor, one of the most famous physicians in America, has prescribed this: total rest. And the remarkable thing, the thing worth staying with tonight, is that she is not recovering from surgery, or a fever, or an injury of any kind. She came to the doctor because she felt sad and tired, and couldn't explain why. And this, the bed, the drawn curtains, the enforced stillness, this was the treatment. Tonight we're talking about the rest cure, about the era when American and British medicine decided that the answer to almost everything, exhaustion, anxiety, grief, ambition, unhappiness, and a condition they called neurasthenia, which could mean nearly anything, was to put the patient in a bed and keep them there, for weeks, sometimes for months. We're talking about the doctors who prescribed it, the science they believed justified it, and the patients, overwhelmingly women, who lay in those darkened rooms and discovered that the cure was, for many of them, considerably worse than whatever had brought them to the doctor in the first place. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if this is genuinely something you look forward to. A sincere thank you to everyone who leaves comments and sends topic ideas. You shape this channel more than you know. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It is always the middle of the night for someone, somewhere, and I find that quietly comforting. And if Spotify is where you prefer to drift off, the link is waiting in the description. Now, settle in properly. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head. Unclench your jaw. You've been holding it again. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. You are allowed to rest tonight. Nobody prescribed it. You just get to. But before we go back to 1887, let's sit with a few questions. Have you ever wondered what happened to a Victorian woman who told her doctor she was exhausted, not sick, just deeply, unaccountably tired of her life? Have you considered what it would feel like to be ordered to do nothing, not permitted to read a book, write a letter, or feed yourself for 6 full weeks, and to be told this was medicine? What kind of scientific reasoning convinced the most respected physicians of the 19th century that stillness cured sadness? Why were men with the exact same symptoms sent west to ride horses and rope cattle, while women were sent to bed? What happened inside the mind of a person forbidden from using it? And who was the woman who went through the rest cure, nearly lost herself inside it, and then wrote a short story about it, so precise and so unsettling that it is still assigned in classrooms 130 years later? A story her own doctor reportedly read, and after which he is said to have changed his treatment. Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1887. Germ theory is still being argued about at medical conferences. Your physician carries a leather bag containing opium, mercury, and a device for administering electrical current to your spine. The most fashionable diagnosis in America is a disease of the nerves called neurasthenia, and it is understood to be caused by modern life itself, by railways, telegraphs, newspapers, and thinking too much. There is a bed upstairs with your name on it. Your doctor believes it is the most powerful medical instrument he owns. Good evening. Let's begin. Let's start with the world this treatment came from, because the rest cure did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of a specific medical universe with its own logic, and once you understand that logic, the whole thing becomes less absurd and considerably more unsettling. Medicine in the 1870s and 1880s was standing at an awkward threshold. The great discoveries were arriving: Pasteur's germ theory, Lister's antiseptic surgery, the first real understanding of how disease actually moved through a body. But the arrival was uneven. A physician trained in 1855 was still practicing in 1885, and what he had been trained in was a much older framework. The idea that the body was a system of energies and forces, that health was a matter of balance, and that illness was what happened when the balance was disturbed. Into this framework came a new problem. The industrialized world was producing a population of people, urban, educated, prosperous, who were not sick in any way the older medicine could name, and yet who were visibly, persistently unwell. They were exhausted without labor. They were anxious without danger. They couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate, couldn't summon interest in their own lives. Their digestion was bad. Their heads ached. They wept without clear cause, or wanted to. American physician George Miller Beard gave this condition a name in 1869. Neurasthenia, literally, weakness of the nerves. And the theory behind the name was, for its time, elegantly modern. Beard proposed that the human nervous system operated like an electrical circuit with a finite supply of energy. Nerve force, he called it, and that modern civilization was draining that supply faster than the body could replenish it. The telegraph, the railroad, the daily newspaper, the pace of business, the pressure of ambition, all of it was drawing down the account. When the account ran empty, you got neurasthenia. Think about what that diagnosis actually offered people. It was not an insult. It was almost a compliment. Neurasthenia was understood as a disease of the civilized, of sensitive, refined, intelligent people whose superior nervous systems were simply too finely tuned for the crude demands of the modern world. Farmers didn't get neurasthenia. Factory workers didn't get neurasthenia, or at least nobody was asking them. Neurasthenia was the ailment of the writer, the businessman, the clergyman's wife, the promising daughter of a good family. Being diagnosed with it confirmed that you were somebody, and if the disease was a depleted battery, the treatment wrote itself. You stopped the drain, you disconnected the circuit, you rested. But rest, in the hands of the man we're about to meet, became something far more elaborate than a suggestion to take it easy. It became a total system, precise, absolute, and enforced. And the man who built that system was, by every account of his era, one of the most brilliant physicians America had ever produced. Silas Weir Mitchell was born in Philadelphia in 1829, the son of a physician, and by the time of the Civil War, he had established himself as one of the sharpest medical minds of his generation. During the war, he ran a hospital for soldiers with nerve injuries, Turner's Lane Hospital in Philadelphia, and the work he did there was genuinely groundbreaking. He documented phantom limb pain with a precision nobody had achieved before. He studied nerve damage, gunshot wounds, the strange persistent agonies of men whose injuries had healed but whose pain had not. His 1864 book on gunshot wounds and nerve injuries became a foundational text. This was not a quack. This was not a fraud selling glowing water from a wagon. This was a serious scientist, a member of every distinguished society, a man other doctors crossed the Atlantic to consult. And it was in those war hospitals that Mitchell began noticing something that would shape everything he did afterward. The soldiers who did best, he observed, were often the ones who were fed most aggressively and rested most completely. Depleted bodies, he concluded, needed two things above all: food and stillness, fat and blood, as he would later title one of his books, with the era's characteristic confidence that a book about medicine could be called Fat and Blood and be taken entirely seriously, which it was. After the war, Mitchell turned his attention to the patients who were filling the waiting rooms of every fashionable physician in America, the neurasthenics, the exhausted wives, the collapsed daughters, the women, and they were mostly women, and we will get to why, whose nervous systems had, by the reckoning of the day, simply run out. And in the 1870s, he assembled the treatment that would make him internationally famous. He called it the rest cure, and it had 5 components, applied together, without compromise. First, rest. Not ordinary rest. Absolute rest. The patient was confined to bed for a period of 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes longer. In the strictest version, she was not permitted to sit up, not permitted to turn over without the assistance of a nurse, not permitted to leave the bed for any purpose whatsoever. Second, seclusion. The patient was removed from her home, her family, her friends, her correspondence. No visitors, no letters, no conversation beyond the minimum required by the nurse and the daily visit from the physician. Mitchell believed, and he was not entirely wrong about this part, which is what makes it complicated, that the families of these women were often part of the problem. The sympathy of relatives, he argued, fed the illness. So the relatives were removed. Third, diet. The patient was fed, enormously. The cornerstone was milk. In the early stages, a diet of nothing but milk, up to 2 quarts a day, delivered in small doses every 2 hours. Then the feeding escalated. Raw eggs beaten into the milk, mutton chops, butter, cream. The goal was visible weight gain. Mitchell wanted his patients fat, in the literal terminology of his own book, because fat was stored nerve force, and a plump patient was a recharging battery. Fourth, massage. Because a body kept completely still for 2 months begins to waste, the muscles were worked daily by a masseuse, an hour or more of systematic kneading, limb by limb. This was exercise without effort. The muscles were used, but the patient's will was not involved, and that was precisely the point. The will was what needed resting. Fifth, electricity. Faradic current, applied to the muscles through electrodes, making them contract and release. Again, movement without volition. The body maintained, the mind switched off. 6 to 8 weeks. Milk, massage, electricity, silence, and a locked door of politeness between the patient and the entire rest of her life. Now, here is the part that the modern retelling of this story sometimes rushes past, and I don't want to rush past it, because it matters. The rest cure often appeared to work. Patients did gain weight. Many of them had arrived genuinely malnourished. Some were in the grip of what we would now recognize as anorexia, which Mitchell treated with striking success by the standards of any era, because aggressive refeeding is in fact what severe anorexia requires. Patients who had not slept properly in years slept. Women who arrived at his practice in states of complete collapse walked out 8 weeks later heavier, steadier, and functional. Mitchell's consulting rooms filled with the wives and daughters of the wealthiest families in America and Britain. His fees became legendary. His waiting list stretched across the Atlantic. Physicians in London, Paris, and Vienna adopted the method. For roughly 40 years, the rest cure was not fringe medicine. It was the standard of care, the most respected treatment from the most respected man in the most respected institutions. And so the question tonight is not how did medicine fall for an obvious fraud? It didn't. The question is stranger and quieter than that. The question is, what happens when a treatment works for the wrong reasons, on the wrong theory, and is applied to people whose actual problem it cannot touch? and in some cases, actively deepens. Because for a very large number of the women sent to those darkened rooms, the problem was not a depleted battery. The problem was the life waiting for them when they got out. Let's go inside the cure itself, not as a summary, as an experience. Because the rest cure is one of those historical facts that stays abstract until you walk through it hour by hour, and then it stops being abstract very quickly. You are 32 years old. It is October of 1887, and you have been unwell for over a year in a way you cannot adequately explain to anyone, including yourself. You are tired in a manner that sleep does not repair. You cry at moments that do not warrant crying. Your household, the one you are responsible for managing, has begun to feel like a machine you are operating from a great distance, with levers that no longer quite connect to anything. Your husband is concerned. Your mother is concerned. The family physician has tried tonics, iron, a change of air at the seashore. Nothing has reached it. And so the letters were written, the arrangements made, and now you are here, in a rented room in Philadelphia, 3 blocks from the office of the famous Dr. Mitchell, because coming to Philadelphia is what one does when one can afford it, and the situation has become serious. The initial consultation is not what you expected. Mitchell is charming, genuinely charming, warm, direct, with the confident ease of a man who has seen your exact situation 1,000 times and finds it entirely solvable. He asks questions. He listens, actually listens, which is more than most physicians have done. He examines you, and then he explains, kindly and without the slightest doubt in his voice, what is wrong with you and what will be done about it. Your nervous system is exhausted. It has been overdrawn by worry, by responsibility, by the demands you have placed upon it. It requires, quite simply, to be shut down and recharged. You will go to bed. You will stay there for 6 weeks, possibly 8. You will see no one. You will do nothing. And at the end of it, he assures you, you will be a new woman. There is something in you, some small, tired, hopeful part, that hears this and nearly weeps with relief. Someone is taking charge. Someone with authority has looked at the shapeless, nameless wrongness of the past year and given it a name and a plan. Permission to stop. Permission to put everything down. You have not been given permission to put anything down in your entire adult life. The first week is, honestly, not terrible. The room is quiet and clean. The nurse is efficient and kind, in a professional, distant way. The milk arrives every 2 hours. A small glass, faintly warm, and you drink it because you are told to, and because there is nothing else to do. And drinking the milk is the only event on the schedule. You sleep enormously. You had forgotten your body could sleep like this. 10 hours, 12, sleep like falling down a well. The exhaustion you carried in through the door begins, genuinely, to drain out of you. When the masseuse works your arms and legs each afternoon, it is pleasant in an odd, impersonal way, like being a garment that is being carefully maintained. You think, perhaps he is right. Perhaps this is all it was, a battery, a depleted account. The second week, the quiet begins to change its character. It is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced enforced stillness the precise moment when rest stops being rest and becomes something else. The room is the same room, the schedule is the same schedule, but your mind, which was too tired to do anything in the first week except sleep, has begun to wake up, and it has absolutely nothing to do. You are not permitted to read. This is the rule you had assumed would be softened once the doctor saw how sensible you were, and it has not been softened. Books excite the brain, and the brain is what is resting. You are not permitted to write, not a letter, not a diary, not a list. You ask the nurse, On day 9, whether you might just have a pencil to note down a few small things you were afraid of forgetting. And she was kind about it, and the answer was no. So the mind, with nothing to hold, begins to circle. You lie on your back and study the ceiling, and you find that you know the ceiling now, its faint crack shaped like a river system, the water stain in the corner like a small brown continent. You listen to the house, footsteps below, a door, the milk cart in the street. The afternoon light crosses the wallpaper in a slow diagonal, and you have begun, without meaning to track its progress the way a prisoner tracks anything that moves, because it is the only thing in the room that does. The wallpaper. You have started to have opinions about the wallpaper. Hold that thought. We will come back to the wallpaper. Someone else noticed it too, in a room very much like this one, and what she did with it changed how history remembers this entire treatment. By the 4th week, you understand something you could not have understood from the outside. The rest cure is not the absence of demands. It is a single, enormous demand. The demand to be nothing, want nothing, think nothing, produce nothing, enforced with perfect politeness, around the clock, by people who believe with complete sincerity that they are healing you. And your body is improving. That is the confusing part. You have gained 11 pounds. Your color is better. You sleep and you eat, and by every measure, the doctor consults on his brief daily visit. The pulse, the weight, the appetite. You are recovering beautifully. He tells you so, warmly, and pats the coverlet, and is gone in 4 minutes, and the door closes, and you are alone with the ceiling and the wallpaper, and a mind that has begun, in the silence, to say things to you that you would very much prefer it did not say. Because here is what the silence does. It removes every external thing you have ever used to avoid your own interior, the household, the children, the correspondence, the sewing, the visits, the 1,000 small tasks of a woman's day, and it leaves you sealed in a room with the one companion you have spent your entire adult life successfully avoiding, yourself. Whatever was underneath the exhaustion, the grief, the anger, the questions about your marriage or your purpose or the shape of the life you were handed, it is all still there, and now there is nothing else in the room but it. Some women broke in that silence. Some women, and this is documented in their own letters and memoirs, came out of the rest cure worse, more frightened, more fragile, further from themselves than when they went in. And some women lay in the dark and did the arithmetic of their own lives and came to conclusions that Dr. Mitchell had absolutely not intended the treatment to produce. Now let's talk about the wallpaper, which means it is time to talk about Charlotte Perkins Gilman. In 1887, the same year we have been imagining, a young woman from New England arrived at Weir Mitchell's practice in Philadelphia. She was 26 years old. Her name was Charlotte Perkins Stetson then. The world would come to know her as Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She was intelligent in a way that her era had no comfortable place for. A reader, a thinker, a woman with ambitions toward writing and lecturing and economic independence at a moment when each of those ambitions was, for a married woman with a child, borderline scandalous. She had married in 1884, somewhat against her own instincts, which she had recorded in her diary with remarkable clarity. She had a daughter in 1885, and in the months after the birth, she descended into a darkness that we would now recognize immediately. The exhaustion, the weeping, the inability to care for the child or herself, the sense of a self-dissolving. Postpartum depression, compounded by the specific despair of a woman watching the life of the mind she had planned for herself disappear into the role she had been assigned. Her era had a different name for it: nervous prostration. hysteria's quieter cousin. And her era had exactly one famous answer, and it lived in Philadelphia. Mitchell examined her. His diagnosis was neurasthenia, and his treatment was the full rest cure: the bed, the milk, the seclusion, the enforced stillness. She underwent it for approximately a month, and by her own account she was, in fact, physically restored by it. She gained weight, she slept, the machinery of the body recovered. Then came the discharge instructions. And the discharge instructions are the part of this story that history has never forgotten, because Gilman herself made sure it wouldn't. Mitchell sent her home with a prescription for the rest of her life. As she recorded it, the instructions were these: live as domestic a life as possible. Have your child with you all the time. Lie down an hour after each meal. Have but 2 hours of intellectual life a day. And never touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as you live. Never touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as you live. Think about what that instruction actually is. Not as malice. Mitchell was not a villain twirling a mustache. He believed, on the theory of the depleted battery, that intellectual work was the drain that had emptied her. Think about it instead as a perfect, crystalline expression of the entire framework, the diagnosis that a woman's mind was the source of her illness, and that the cure was the amputation of the mind's entire output. Her body would be maintained. Her interior life would be closed, like a wing of a house too expensive to heat. Gilman went home and tried to follow the instructions. She tried for months, and she later wrote, in plain language, what following them did to her. It brought her, in her own words, so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that she could see over. She described crawling into closets and under beds. She described sitting and weeping over nothing, rocking, hiding from the accumulating weight of a prescription that required her to be a body without an author. The domestic life, the constant presence of the child she loved but could not properly care for, the 2 rationed hours of thought, the forbidden pen. The treatment was completing the collapse it had been designed to prevent. And then she did the thing that saved her, and it was the exact opposite of the prescription. She stopped. She left. Eventually she left the marriage itself, an act of almost unthinkable social cost in 1888. She moved to California, and she picked up the pen. In 1890, she wrote a short story. It took her 2 days. It is about 6,000 words long. You can read it in half an hour, and it is called The Yellow Wallpaper. The story is narrated by a woman whose physician husband has taken her to a country house for a rest cure. She is forbidden to write. She writes the story itself in secret, in stolen moments, which is the first quiet knife the story slips in. She is installed in an upstairs room, a former nursery, with barred windows and a bed nailed to the floor, and a sprawling, flamboyant, sickly yellow wallpaper. And over the course of the story, with nothing to do and no one to speak to, and a husband who answers every fear with a soothing dismissal, he calls her little girl. He tells her she is getting better whether she feels it or not. The narrator's entire mind pours itself into the only object available, the wallpaper. She studies it. She maps its pattern. She begins to see, behind the pattern, a woman, trapped, creeping, shaking the bars of the design, trying to get out. By the final page, the narrator has locked the door, torn the paper from the walls in sheets, and is creeping around the perimeter of the room on her hands and knees, over and over, her shoulder tracing a groove in the wall. Her husband breaks in and faints. Faints, the man of medicine, the voice of reason, and she keeps creeping, right over his body, saying that she has got out at last. I am not going to tell you that story again in detail, because you should read it, and because we are here to sleep, not to lie awake. But here is what matters for tonight. Gilman was not writing a ghost story. She said so explicitly. She was writing a clinical report from the inside, a document of what the rest cure's silence actually did to a mind that was forbidden every outlet except the pattern on the wall. The story is the room. The room is the treatment. The woman behind the wallpaper is every patient the theory could not see. The story was published in 1892 in the New England magazine. Some readers took it as gothic horror. At least one physician wrote in protest that such a story should never have been printed at all. But it stayed. It circulated. It became, slowly and then permanently, the single most famous account of the rest cure ever written, the patient's rebuttal, outliving every one of the doctor's textbooks. And Gilman, years later, added the detail that turns the story into history. She wrote that she had sent a copy to Mitchell himself. He never replied to her, but she recorded that she had learned, through friends, that the great man had altered his treatment of nervous prostration after reading it. Whether that is precisely true, whether Mitchell changed, and how much, and why, historians still argue about. Mitchell, for the record, never publicly credited her, but Gilman put her conclusion in one sentence, and it is the sentence this whole night has been circling. She said that if the story changed his practice, then she had not lived in vain. She had been told never to touch a pen again as long as she lived. The pen is the only reason we know her name. Now we come to the question that has been sitting under this entire story, and it deserves to be examined slowly, because it is where the rest cure stops being a curiosity of old medicine and becomes something sharper. Why women? Because it was women. Not exclusively. Men were diagnosed with neurasthenia in enormous numbers, and we will get to what happened to them in a moment, because what happened to them is the single most revealing fact in this whole history. But the rest cure, the full apparatus, the bed, the seclusion, the forbidden pen, was applied overwhelmingly to female patients. And the reasoning behind that was not hidden or unconscious. It was written down, published, and taught. Victorian medicine held, as a matter of settled science, that women's bodies were governed by their reproductive systems in a way men's simply were not. The uterus and the nervous system were understood to be wired together in a closed economy of energy. A woman possessed a fixed budget of vital force, and that budget was earmarked, by nature, by design, for reproduction and motherhood. Every other expenditure was a withdrawal from that account, and the most dangerous expenditure of all, the one the textbooks warned about specifically, was thinking. This was not a fringe position. Edward Clark, a professor at Harvard Medical School, published a book in 1873 called Sex in Education, which argued in earnest, with case studies, that higher education physically damaged women, that the energy required for serious study was diverted from the developing reproductive organs, producing sickness, sterility, and collapse. The book was a bestseller. It went through 17 editions. It was cited for decades as scientific proof that a woman at a desk was a woman in danger. So when a woman arrived at a physician's office exhausted, weeping, unable to explain herself, a woman who read too much, wanted too much, felt the walls of her role pressing in, the diagnostic framework was already waiting for her. She had overspent. She had used the mind at the expense of the body. The treatment followed with perfect internal logic. Shut down the mind completely, feed the body aggressively, and return her, restored, quieted, grateful, to the domestic sphere, where her energy belonged. Rest, for her, meant erasure. Bed, silence, milk, and the closed door. Now watch what happened when the patient was a man. Weir Mitchell had male neurasthenics too, plenty of them. Businessmen burned down to the wick, overworked scholars, young men of good families who had collapsed under strain. Their diagnosis was the same word. Their depleted battery was the same battery. Their prescription was to go west. Mitchell called it, and the era called it, the West Cure. The exhausted man was sent to the Dakotas, to Montana, to the ranch country, to ride horses, drive cattle, sleep outdoors, hunt, climb, and write about it. Not forbidden the pen. Encouraged to use it, vigorous journaling was part of the program. The male patient was prescribed activity, autonomy, open air, physical challenge, and the company of other men doing difficult things. The list of men who took some version of the West Cure reads like a stage direction for the next 50 years of American culture. Theodore Roosevelt, hollowed out by grief after losing his wife and mother on the same day in 1884, went to the Badlands and came back, by his own telling and everyone else's, remade. The ranching years became the foundation of the entire Rough Rider mythology that carried him to the presidency. Walt Whitman spent time under Mitchell's care. Owen Wister, another Mitchell patient, was sent to Wyoming for his nerves, and out of that trip he eventually wrote The Virginian, the novel that essentially invented the cowboy western as a genre. Thomas Eakins, the painter, went west on the same logic. Sit with that arithmetic for a moment, because it is the whole story in a single frame. The same doctor, the same diagnosis, the same theory of the same depleted nervous energy, and the treatment splits perfectly along one line. The men are given a horse, a rifle, a notebook, and the horizon. The women are given a bed, a bowl of milk, and a locked door of politeness, and told the pen will kill them. The treatment was never really about the nerves. The treatment was about returning each patient to their proper station, and the station, not the science, determined the cure. For a man, health meant strenuous action in the world, so the cure was action. For a woman, health meant contented domesticity, so the cure was a dress rehearsal for contented domesticity, conducted in a bed, under supervision, until she agreed to it. The rest cure worked, when it worked, the way a splint works, and it harmed, when it harmed, the way a splint applied to a healthy limb harms, by immobilizing something that was never broken, until it began to break in earnest. And the women knew. That is the part the archives keep insisting on. Not all of them, not all at once. But the letters and diaries of the era are full of women doing exactly the arithmetic we just did. Gilman did it in 6,000 words. Alice James, sister of Henry and William, a brilliant diarist confined by nervous illness for most of her adult life, did it in her journal, with an irony so dry it could strike matches, noting the procession of physicians who examined her and the treatments that treated everything except her actual life. Virginia Woolf, a generation later, was subjected to versions of the rest cure repeatedly. The weight charts, the milk, the forbidden writing, the removal from London and friends whenever her doctors judged her overstimulated. And she took her revenge in fiction, putting the smooth, deaf certainty of society nerve doctors into Mrs. Dalloway in the figure of Sir William Bradshaw, a physician whose religion is called proportion and who breaks his patients on the wheel of it. Woolf's case adds the darkest note in this register, and I will say it carefully and briefly. The treatments never reached what was actually wrong. The supervision she lived under was itself a weight, and her story did not end gently. The failure of this framework was not an abstraction. It had costs that were paid in full, by real people, over whole lifetimes. Let's step back now and follow the rest cure through an ordinary day. Not the patient's day this time, but the household's. Because one of the strangest features of this treatment, seen from a distance, is how much labor and money and social machinery was required to produce one person doing absolutely nothing. A full Mitchell-style rest cure was, first of all, staggeringly expensive. There was the physician's fee, and Mitchell's fees were the stuff of professional legend. There was the rented room or the private sanitarium bed. There was the trained nurse, on duty around the clock for 2 months. There was the masseuse, daily. There was the food, the endless milk, the chops, the cream, delivered on schedule like coal to a furnace. Estimates for a complete course ran into hundreds of dollars at a time when a skilled workman might earn that in a year. The rest cure was a luxury good. It was, in the economics of the era, roughly what a year of college cost, spent instead on 8 weeks of enforced nothing. Which tells you immediately who received it and who did not. The farm wife with the same exhaustion, the mill worker with the same weeping spells, the servant girl with the same collapse. These women did not get a rest cure. They got tonics if they were lucky, the asylum if they were not, and in most cases they simply got up the next morning and went back to work because the diagnosis of neurasthenia, that badge of the finely tuned nervous system, was not really available at their income level. Exhaustion in a wealthy woman was a disease of civilization. Exhaustion in a poor woman was Tuesday. So picture the house that hosts a rest cure. It is a good house, in a good neighborhood. Upstairs, behind a closed door, a woman lies in a dim room being paid for by the hour. Downstairs, the household she used to run is being run by other women. The cook, the housemaid, a sister or mother drafted in to manage the children. The nurse passes up and down the stairs with trays. The masseuse arrives at 2. The doctor's carriage stops outside at 4, and the whole house adjusts itself around his visit the way a tide adjusts to the moon. Voices lowered, children shushed. The good front room ready in case he wishes to speak with the husband. And the husband. He is not a cartoon in this story either, and it is worth standing in his shoes for one honest moment. He is, in most cases, genuinely frightened. The woman he married has gone somewhere he cannot follow and cannot name, and the most respected medical authority in the country has told him, with total confidence, that the path back runs through this room, this schedule, this bill, and that the kindest thing he can do is enforce it. So he enforces it. He intercepts the letters. He turns away the visiting friend. He does it with love, which is precisely what makes the machinery so hard to fight. Then, and in every era since, the door is locked from the outside by people who would swear on their lives, truthfully, that they are only trying to help. Have you noticed what the rest cure actually built? Assembled piece by piece. A woman in a bed she cannot leave, in a room she cannot alter, on a schedule she does not control, fed what she is given, denied her own words, surrounded by kindness, and monitored by an authority whose verdict on her progress is the only verdict that counts. Victorian medicine, working from a theory of batteries and nerve force, had constructed, with the best of intentions and the finest of credentials, a nearly perfect replica of the condition it was supposedly treating. The patient's original complaint, in so many of these cases, was that her life had become a small, airless room in which nothing she did or said or wanted carried any weight. The cure was a smaller room. And this is the deep pattern, the one worth carrying past tonight, past this particular treatment, into the way you look at any era's confident medicine, including our own. The rest cure endured for 40 years, not because the evidence supported it, but because it fit. It fit the theory of the day, which said nerve force was a budget. It fit the economics of the day, which made elaborate treatment a mark of status. And above all, it fit the social order of the day, which already believed that a restless, ambitious, unhappy woman was a woman malfunctioning, so a treatment that returned her to stillness looked, by definition, like success. When a treatment confirms what a society already believes about the patient, the bar of proof drops almost to the floor. Nobody demands rigorous evidence for a conclusion they walked in with. The unraveling, when it came slowly and from several directions at once. The way these things always seem to come apart in this series, and by now you may be noticing that this is not a coincidence of storytelling, but the actual shape of how knowledge moves. The patients testified. Gilman's story in 1892 was the loudest single shot, but it was one voice in a growing chorus of memoirs, letters, and quiet warnings passed between women. Do not send her to the rest cure. It nearly destroyed my sister. That traveled through exactly the social channels no medical journal could monitor or refute. The theory collapsed underneath it. Neurasthenia itself, the depleted battery, did not survive the new century's medicine. As neurology matured, as Freud and the psychological frameworks rose, as clinicians looked harder at what these patients actually had, the grand unified diagnosis dissolved into a dozen more precise ones: depression, anxiety, anemia, thyroid disease, postpartum illness, and sometimes simply an intolerable situation producing an entirely rational despair. By the 1920s, neurasthenia was fading from the textbooks. A treatment built for a disease that no longer existed could not outlive it by much. And the world moved. The women's movement, education, the vote, the slow prying open of professions, the walls of the room got farther apart, and the number of brilliant women whose distress could be plausibly attributed to too much thinking began its long decline toward absurdity. By the 1930s and 40s, the strict rest cure was essentially gone. And then medicine did something almost poetic. It reversed the sign entirely. 20th century research, much of it fittingly from studying soldiers and surgical patients, established that prolonged total bed rest is not neutral. It is actively harmful. Muscles waste measurably within days. Bones lose density. Blood clots form. Hearts decondition. Mood deteriorates. The modern hospital gets patients on their feet as fast as safely possible, precisely because we now know what 8 weeks of enforced stillness does to a human body. The treatment that was once the gold standard is now, in its strict form, something close to a textbook example of iatrogenic harm caused by the healing itself. Mitchell died in 1914, honored, wealthy, and famous, a founder of American neurology, which he genuinely was, with the rebuttal to his most famous invention already circulating in classrooms he would never see. History kept both verdicts. It usually does. Let's go deeper into neurasthenia itself for a while, because the diagnosis deserves more attention than we have given it, and because the story of how an entire civilization convinced itself it was suffering from a single, invisible, unmeasurable disease is one of the stranger episodes in the history of medicine, and it is also, if you listen closely, oddly familiar. George Miller Beard did not merely name neurasthenia in 1869. He built it a mythology. In 1881, he published a book called American Nervousness, and the title alone tells you half of what you need to know, because Beard argued, in complete earnest, that neurasthenia was not just a disease that happened to occur in America. It was America's disease, a national possession, almost a national achievement. His reasoning ran like this. The United States, more than any nation on earth, had embraced the 5 great engines of modern civilization. Beard listed them explicitly: steam power, the periodical press, the telegraph, the sciences, and the mental activity of women. Those were his 5, And each of these engines, he argued, placed demands on the human nervous system that no previous generation had faced. The businessman checking stock prices by telegraph was spending nerve force at a rate his grandfather, checking prices by monthly letter, never had to. The reader of a daily newspaper was processing the disasters of the entire planet before breakfast. The very punctuality of modern life, the railway timetable, the pocket watch, the appointment, was, in Beard's account, a slow tax on the nerves that agricultural humanity had never been asked to pay. Have you noticed that this argument has never actually gone away? Every generation since Beard has produced its own version. The disease of the pace of things, the exhaustion caused by too much information arriving too fast, the sense that the human nervous system was built for a slower world and is being run beyond its design specifications. Beard was writing about the telegraph. His great-great-grandchildren would write nearly identical paragraphs about television, and their children about the internet, and theirs about the phone on your nightstand right now. The vocabulary changes. The diagnosis, modernity itself, drawn down against the body's finite account, has been continuously in print for 150 years, which does not mean it was entirely wrong. That is the uncomfortable, interesting part. People in 1880 were genuinely exhausted, genuinely anxious, genuinely sleepless, just as the neurasthenic's descendants are now. The suffering was never fake. What was shaky was the mechanism, the battery, the nerve force, the fixed account. Beard had taken a real cluster of human misery and attached it to a piece of physics that did not exist. And once the mechanism was accepted, everything downstream of it, including the rest cure, followed with perfect logic from a premise nobody could test. The list of symptoms Beard attributed to neurasthenia is worth hearing, at least in part, because its sheer breadth explains how the diagnosis conquered the world. In his published work, the symptoms included insomnia, flushing, drowsiness, bad dreams, headache, pressure and heaviness in the head, tenderness of the scalp, dilated pupils, floating specks before the eyes, noises in the ears, deficient mental control, hopelessness, morbid fears, fear of open places, fear of closed places, fear of society, fear of being alone, fear of fears, indigestion, palpitations, cold hands and feet, yawning, itching, tremulousness, and dozens more. The full published lists ran to over 70 entries. Think about what a list like that actually is, diagnostically. It is a net with no holes. There is no human being alive, in any century, who does not have several items from that list at any given moment. A diagnosis that everything confirms and nothing can rule out is not, in the modern sense, a diagnosis at all. It is a mirror. Whatever you brought into the consulting room, neurasthenia had a place for it. And that was not a flaw in the diagnosis's career. It was the engine of it. Because consider what the alternative diagnoses were. For a woman in 1880 presenting with exhaustion, weeping and dread, the older category waiting for her was hysteria, a word soaked in centuries of contempt, carrying the explicit meaning of a malfunctioning womb and the implicit meaning of a malfunctioning character. Hysteria was an accusation wearing a stethoscope. Neurasthenia, by contrast, was almost courtly. It said, "Nothing is wrong with your character. Your character is, if anything, too fine. You are a delicate instrument that has been played too hard." The neurasthenic was not weak-willed. She was over-civilized, which in the status mathematics of the Gilded Age was nearly a compliment. So patients did not resist the diagnosis. They sought it. Physicians who could confer it, and who offered a dignified scientific-sounding treatment to go with it, found their waiting rooms full. There was, and this should be said plainly because it was true, and everyone at the time knew it was true, a great deal of money in nerves. Beard himself was accused by colleagues of having invented a fashionable disease for a fashionable clientele. The accusation did not slow the disease down in the slightest. Fashionable diseases never are slowed by that accusation, in any century. And neurasthenia traveled. It crossed the Atlantic and was taken up enthusiastically in Britain, Germany, France. It reached Japan, where it became Shinkei Suijaku, and had a long clinical career of its own. By 1900, the American disease was a world citizen. The World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases, remarkably, carried neurasthenia as a listed diagnosis deep into the 21st century, long after American and British medicine had abandoned it, and in some countries it remained a working clinical term within living memory. The battery theory died. The word, incredibly, almost outlived everyone who believed in it. Now let's widen the frame beyond Mitchell's private practice, because the rest cure did not stay a Philadelphia specialty. It became an industry, and the industry had architecture. The second half of the 19th century was the great age of the sanitarium. Across America and Europe, in mountain valleys and at mineral springs and on quiet rural estates, institutions rose to receive the nervous, the exhausted, and the vaguely unwell of the prosperous classes. Some were essentially hotels with doctors. Some were serious medical establishments. Most lived somewhere in between, places where the therapeutic and the fashionable blurred into a single experience that a family could pay for without shame, because attending a sanitarium was not like being committed to an asylum. That distinction was the entire business model. The asylum was for the mad and the poor. The sanitarium was for the tired and the solvent. The most famous of them all was Battle Creek, in Michigan, run by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. Yes, that Kellogg, the cornflake Kellogg. The cereal was invented there as sanitarium health food, which is its own strange story for another night. Battle Creek, at its height, was a small city of wellness. Thousands of patients a year taking hydrotherapy, light baths, vibration treatments, prescribed exercise, and diets of scientific blandness. The Battle Creek approach was actually the philosophical opposite of Mitchell's in one respect. Kellogg believed in activity, in exercise, in what he called the biologic life, and yet the two systems served the same clientele, treated the same diagnosis, and shared the same underlying promise, that the formless misery of modern comfortable life could be checked into an institution, submitted to a regimen, and cured on a schedule. For the rest cure specifically, the institutional version softened some of Mitchell's edges and sharpened others. In a private home, the rest cure required assembling the whole apparatus, nurse, masseuse, physician, cooperative family, from scratch. A sanitarium had the apparatus permanently installed, the quiet corridors, the staff trained in the protocols, the schedule printed and enforced, the other patients, glimpsed at a distance, whose presence confirmed that one's own condition was real and respectable and shared. Seclusion was easier to maintain when the entire building was designed for it. So was compliance. It is one thing to defy a nurse in your own guest bedroom. It is another to defy an institution. And here is a detail from the records of these places that is worth turning over slowly. The physicians who ran rest cures consistently reported that the treatment's success depended enormously on what they called the moral influence of the physician, meaning, in the language of the day, the doctor's personal authority over the patient. Mitchell wrote about this openly. The cure worked, he taught, only when the patient surrendered completely, when her will was, in effect, handed over at the door. He selected his nurses specifically to be kind but immovable. He advised physicians administering the cure to be pleasant, firm, and absolutely never negotiable. Resistance was not a sign the treatment was wrong for the patient. Resistance was a symptom. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the single most self-sealing piece of logic in this entire story. If the patient improves, the cure works. If the patient objects, the objection is the disease talking, which proves how much she needs the cure. There is no outcome, none, that counts as evidence against the treatment. Modern medicine has a name for reasoning built this way, and it is not a compliment. But in 1885 it was simply called clinical experience, and it was taught and it was believed by serious people acting in good faith, which is exactly what made it so durable, and exactly why the testimony of patients like Gilman, arriving from entirely outside the medical literature, mattered so much. The system could not hear a no from inside itself. The no had to come from a short story. Let's spend some time now with a single day of the cure, the full circuit of it, hour by hour, from the other side of the door. Because we walked through the patient's weeks earlier, now walk through the nurse's day, and the room's day, and the schedule's day, because the rest cure was above all a schedule, and schedules are where an idea becomes a lived world. 6 in the morning. The nurse, call her Miss Hale, because there were hundreds of Miss Hales, trained women for whom rest cure nursing was a respectable and comparatively well-paid specialty, wakes in the small adjoining room. She washes, dresses, pins her hair, and enters the patient's room quietly to open the shutters exactly as far as the doctor's standing instructions permit, which in the early weeks is barely at all. The room must be light enough for care, dim enough for calm. She checks the patient, pulse, color, the quality of the night's sleep, which she will record in the daybook that the doctor reads at 4. 7. The first milk, warmed slightly, carried up, administered while the patient is still lying flat. In the strict phase, the patient does not hold the glass herself. Miss Hale supports her head. This is not laziness and it is not cruelty, it is protocol. The muscular effort of sitting and holding is an expenditure, and expenditures are the enemy. Afterward, the washing, face, hands, the slow, careful business of bathing a grown woman in sections, in bed, with basins carried up and down the stairs by a housemaid who is never permitted past the threshold. 9. The doctor's standing orders reviewed. The second feeding. Milk again, perhaps with the beaten egg now, if the week's schedule has advanced to eggs. The patient may be turned. Turning is an event. It is noted in the book. 11. The massage. The masseuse arrives, a specialist, often trained in the Swedish movements, engaged for the full course of the cure, and for the next hour, the patient's body is systematically worked. Feet, calves, thighs, hands, arms, shoulders, back, circulation, the muscles reminded of their function without being consulted. The patient, by the accounts many of them later wrote, drifts during this hour in a strange passivity that some found soothing and some found almost unbearable, the body handled like an object of maintenance, expertly, impersonally, daily. 1. Dinner, which in the ascending phases of the diet is no longer only milk, a chop minced fine, bread and butter, cream. The quantities are not negotiable, and this was, for many patients, the cure's most genuinely difficult front. The daybook records what was consumed and what was refused. Refusals are reported. Mitchell's writings are blunt about the response to sustained refusal. The feeding happens. The battery must be filled. Appetite is not consulted, any more than the muscles were. 2. Rest, which is to say, the official rest inside the general rest, the deep, afternoon hush, when even the nurse withdraws to her chair, with her mending, and the house below drops its voice. This is the hour the patient's memoirs return to, again and again. The light on the wallpaper, the sounds of the street arriving like news from a foreign country. The mind, fed and massaged and utterly unemployed, beginning its slow circling. One patient later wrote that she spent this hour every day composing letters she would never be permitted to send, revising them, perfecting them, an entire correspondence conducted inside her skull. Another counted objects, flowers on the paper, carriage wheels outside. The mind will make work. It is the one thing that cannot be put to bed. 4. The doctor, the carriage, the lowered voices, the 4 minutes. Pulse, weight if it is a weighing day, a glance at the daybook, a few warm, confident words. He is kind. That should be said again, because it was almost always true, and it is almost the hardest part. He is kind, and he is pleased with her progress, and his pleasure is the only grade she receives, on the only work she is permitted to do, which is nothing. Patients wrote about the strange intensity of these 4 minutes, how the entire shapeless day organized itself around them, how his approval landed like sunlight, how they caught themselves performing recovery for him, brightening on schedule, and then wondered, in the long hush after the carriage pulled away, whether the brightening was real or whether they were simply learning the role. The cure could not tell the difference. That was, depending on how you look at it, its greatest weakness or its actual mechanism. 6. Supper, milk, perhaps cocoa now, in the later weeks, the schedule's small mercies. 8. The room settled for the night, the lamp lowered. Miss Hale's last entries in the book, pulse, mood, described in the era's vocabulary, cheerful, fretful, quiet, and the door left ajar to the adjoining room, because the patient is never fully alone, which is another sentence that can be read 2 entirely different ways, and both readings are true. And then the night, which belonged to no schedule, and which the daybooks could not record, and about which we therefore know only what the patients themselves chose to tell us afterward. Some slept, gratefully, enormously. Some lay awake doing the arithmetic, and at least one, in a room with a sprawling, flamboyant, sickly yellow paper on the walls, lay watching the pattern in the moonlight, and beginning to see something moving behind it. Multiply that day by 50. That is the cure. Not an event but a repetition, the same circuit of milk and massage and 4 minutes of sunlight, laid down day after day like coats of paint, until the patient was either genuinely restored or thoroughly trained or quietly composing 6,000 words in her head that the daybook would never see. Now I want to keep a promise from earlier and spend proper time with 2 more patients, because Gilman was not alone, and the pattern only becomes fully visible when you see it repeat in very different lives. Alice James was born in 1848, into what may have been the most formidably intellectual family in America. Her brother William effectively founded American psychology. Her brother Henry became one of the greatest novelists in the English language. The James household ran on ideas the way other households ran on coal. Debate at dinner, Europe every few years. A father who theorized about everything, including his own children. And Alice, the only daughter, was by the family's own accounts as sharp as any of them. The letters and the diary she left behind are proof. A prose intelligence as cutting as Henry's, aimed with more economy. But the life available to William was not available to Alice, and the life available to Henry was not available to Alice. And what was available to Alice, the daughter's position, the companion's position, the waiting position, proved uninhabitable for her almost from the start. She had her first major breakdown at 19, another catastrophic at 30. She spent virtually her entire adult life as an invalid, moving between treatments, physicians, and therapeutic regimens on both sides of the Atlantic, accumulating diagnoses the way her brothers accumulated publications. Neurasthenia, naturally. Hysteria, spinal weakness, rheumatic gout. She underwent galvanic electrical treatments. She took the blistering and the tonics. She did versions of the rest cure. Nothing reached it, because the it that needed reaching was not located anywhere the instruments were pointed. What makes Alice James unforgettable is what she did with her situation in the last years of her life, dying of breast cancer in England, a diagnosis she received, according to her diary, with something close to relief, because at last, she wrote, she had a real, palpable, mortal disease that no one could attribute to her nerves. She kept a journal. And the journal, published after her death, is one of the great documents of the 19th century, precisely because it turns the century's clinical gaze around and aims it back. She writes about her doctors with a dissecting irony they never suspected they were under. She describes the procession of eminent men who examined her body and lectured her about her nervous system while remaining perfectly, professionally incurious about her actual existence. At one point, she observes that she had been advised, essentially, to cultivate stillness her whole life, and notes what an achievement it had been, harder than any of her brother's books, to go on existing at all under that prescription. She died in 1892, the same year the yellow Wallpaper was published, which history did not plan but might as well have. 2 documents, appearing in the same 12 months, the short story and the diary, the fictional patient and the real one, both writing, against explicit or implicit instruction, the account the daybooks never kept. And then, a generation later, Virginia Woolf, where the pattern repeats with the volume turned up, because Woolf was treated not at the height of the rest cure's confidence but during its long decline, when the theory was already crumbling and the apparatus kept operating anyway, on momentum, the way apparatuses do. Woolf's breakdowns began in adolescence and recurred through her life, and the treatment she received, again and again, was recognizably Mitchell's system with an English accent. Bed, isolation, weight charts, milk and meat in prescribed quantities, removal from London, and, always, centrally, restriction of the one activity that constituted her entire reason for being. Her doctors rationed her writing the way Mitchell had rationed Gilman's. Reading was monitored. Visitors were controlled. Her weight was tracked as the primary index of her sanity, pounds standing in for wellness on the theory, still limping along decades after Beard, that a fed body meant a filled battery. She hated it. That is not an inference. It is all over her letters and diaries, in her own voice, the fury at being managed, the particular humiliation of the weight chart, the way the treatment addressed everything about her except her, and she took the revenge available to a novelist. In Mrs. Dalloway, published in 1925, the shell-shocked veteran Septimus Smith is delivered into the hands of Sir William Bradshaw, a fashionable, celebrated nerve specialist whom Woolf constructs with surgical hatred. Bradshaw worships a goddess he calls proportion. He prescribes rest, seclusion, milk, and the surrender of the self. He has never, the novel observes, been known to be wrong, because he has arranged the definitions so that he cannot be. Septimus, facing forcible removal to one of Bradshaw's homes, goes out a window instead. Woolf knew exactly what she was writing. She had faced the same homes, and the fact that the sharpest portrait of the rest cure physician in all of literature was written by a patient, 30 years after Gilman's, on the other side of an ocean, in a completely different literary register, tells you something the medical journals of neither era could. The patients recognized each other. Across decades and continents, without coordination, the people inside the treatment kept producing the same report. The treatment could not hear it. Literature could. There is a genre here, if you step back far enough to see it. Call it the patient's rebuttal, Gilman's story, Alice James's diary, Woolf's novel. Add the letters, the memoirs, the warnings passed between sisters and friends. An entire counter-literature, written from inside the dim rooms, preserved not in medical archives, but in the ordinary channels of writing and publishing and keeping, and ultimately more durable than the treatment it answered. Mitchell's Fat and Blood is read today by historians. The Yellow Wallpaper is read by everyone. The verdict of history, it turns out, is not written by the person holding the daybook. It is written by the person who was told never to touch a pen. Let's give the men their full chapter now, because the West cure deserves more than the sketch we gave it, and because following one particular patient west turns out to explain a surprising amount of the America that came after. In February of 1884, Theodore Roosevelt was 25 years old, a rising New York assemblyman with a new baby daughter, and on a single day, the 14th of February, his wife and his mother died in the same house, hours apart. His diary entry for that date is famous. A large X and one line, "The light has gone out of my life." Roosevelt was, by any modern reading, a textbook candidate for the diagnosis of his era. He was shattered, sleepless, unable to remain in the rooms of his old life. He was also precisely the demographic, educated, prosperous, high-strung, driven, that the Neurasthenia framework had been built around. He had in fact been a delicate, asthmatic, nervous child of exactly the sort the nerve doctors worried over. Had he been his sister, it is not hard to guess what would have been prescribed. What he did instead, with his physician's era-appropriate blessing, because this was the sanctioned masculine treatment, was hand off the baby to his sister, board a train, and go to the Dakota Badlands, where he had recently bought into a cattle ranch. And for the better part of 3 years, in stretches, the future president lived the West cure at maximum dosage. 14-hour days in the saddle, cattle drives, blizzards. A documented episode in which he tracked and captured 3 boat thieves and marched them overland for days to the nearest jail, reading Tolstoy to stay awake. He hunted, he wrote, constantly, books and articles about ranch life, because remember, the pen was prescribed for men. He arrived a hollowed-out widower in spectacles, whom the local cowhands openly mocked. He left, by his own account, and the account of essentially every biographer since, rebuilt. He said, later and repeatedly, that he never would have become president if it had not been for his years in North Dakota. Now, the honest complication. The West cure, unlike the rest cure, sort of worked, at least for some men, at least visibly. Sunlight, exertion, purpose, autonomy, distance from grief's geography, the company of people who did not know your tragedy. A modern clinician would recognize 6 legitimately therapeutic ingredients in that list. Behavioral activation, we would call some of it now. The prescription was built on the same nonsense battery theory, but the activities it happened to prescribe were genuinely good for a certain kind of despair, in a way that enforced immobility in a dark room was not, which makes the asymmetry worse, not better, because it means the era possessed and used a treatment for nervous collapse that involved agency, movement, meaningful work, and the open air, and reserved it, as a matter of explicit medical doctrine, for men. Mitchell himself wrote the doctrine down. His prescription for the overworked man, in his own published words, ran to the saddle, the gun, the rod, and the camp. The woman with identical symptoms got the bed, because the theory held that her nature required return to stillness, the way his required return to vigor. The treatments were not two guesses at the same problem. They were two different verdicts about what a human being was for. And the West cure had one more legacy, stranger and larger than any individual recovery. It helped write the American mythology itself. Owen Wister, sent west by Mitchell for his nerves in 1885, turned his therapeutic Wyoming summers into The Virginian in 1902, the novel that codified the entire cowboy genre. The laconic hero, the showdown, the schoolmarm, all of it, dedicated, incidentally, to his friend Theodore Roosevelt. Frederick Remington, whose paintings and sculptures fixed the visual image of the American West permanently in the world's mind, went west in the first place partly for his health, which produces one of those historical sentences that sounds like a joke and is simply true, a significant portion of the myth of the American cowboy, the most durable image of rugged, self-reliant masculinity the culture ever produced, was manufactured by anxious, overworked Eastern gentlemen who had been sent to ranches by their nerve doctors. The frontier as prescription, the Western as a side effect. And on the other side of the same consulting room, the same decade, the same theory, the yellow wallpaper, the two great documents of American neurasthenia, written by the two halves of the same patient population, sent through the two different doors. He got the horizon and wrote the myth of freedom. She got the nursery with the barred windows and wrote the myth's exact photographic negative. Read together, and they almost never are read together, which is a shame. They are a single report on what a civilization believed its men and women were made of, filed from the two rooms it sent them to find out. There is one more room to visit before we come back toward the present, and it is the hardest one, so we will be careful in it. But this story is not complete without it, because the rest cure was the gentle end of a spectrum, and the spectrum had another end. Everything we have described so far, the rented rooms, Miss Hale, the 4 minutes of sunlight, belonged to women whose families could pay, and whose collapse had been diagnosed as nervous rather than mental. That distinction, nervous versus mental, was the most consequential line in a Victorian woman's medical life, and it was drawn less by symptoms than by money and marriageability and how much trouble she was causing. On the nervous side of the line, neurasthenia, the rest cure, the sanitarium, the return home. On the mental side, the asylum. And the asylum records of the 19th century, which survive in archives on both sides of the Atlantic and have been studied in detail by historians, contain admission registers whose stated causes of insanity for female patients include entries that are difficult to read now without a long pause. Novel reading, religious excitement, domestic trouble, disappointed affection, overstudy, suppressed grief. A woman could be committed, legally, indefinitely, on the certification of physicians and the petition of a husband or father, for conditions whose descriptions amount, at this distance, to having an inner life that inconvenienced someone. We are not going to spend the night in the asylums. That is a heavier story than a sleep channel should carry all the way down, and the people in it deserve a telling that is not designed to be drifted away from. But the asylum has to stand at the edge of tonight's frame for one reason. It was the unspoken alternative that made the rest cure work. Every woman lying in a dim, expensive room drinking her scheduled milk knew, at some level of awareness, what the other door looked like. Compliance with the gentle system was purchased, in part, by the existence of the ungentle one. When Gilman's narrator hides her writing, when Woolf submits again to the weight chart, when Alice James performs cheerfulness for the visiting eminence. The asylum is in the room. It is standing quietly in the corner of every one of these stories, saying nothing, which was all it ever needed to do. That is the full architecture then. The West for the men. The rest cure for the tractable women of means. The asylum for the rest. 3 doors, 1 theory, and behind all 3, the same unexamined question. What is this person actually suffering from? Postponed, in some cases, for a century. So let's talk about the century. Because the rest cure did not simply vanish in the 1920s with Neurasthenia's name. It went underground and kept flowing, and if you know where to look, you can trace the channel almost to the present. The most direct descendant hid in plain sight, in obstetrics. For most of the 20th century, and well within living memory, prescribed bed rest was the reflexive answer to complications of pregnancy, threatened miscarriage, high blood pressure, twins, preterm labor risk. Women were sent to bed for weeks, sometimes months. Whole wings of hospitals held them. And here is the remarkable part. When the treatment was finally subjected to rigorous modern trials, the evidence for benefit largely was not there. Study after study, position statements from the major obstetric bodies, the conclusion, arrived at embarrassingly recently, was that strict bed rest generally does not prevent the outcomes it was prescribed for, while it does reliably produce muscle wasting, blood clots, bone loss, financial harm, and depression. The professional guidance now recommends against routine bed rest for most of its historical indications, which means that for the better part of 100 years after Mitchell, medicine went on prescribing enforced stillness to women, pregnant women, this time, on the strength of intuition, tradition, and the deep cultural reflex that a woman in trouble should lie down and stop, long after the theory that started it all was dead. The battery was gone. The bed remained. And the reversal, when it finally came in general medicine, was total. Modern hospital care is organized around the opposite principle, early mobilization. Patients are walked, sometimes within hours of major surgery. Cardiac patients, who in the 1950s were kept flat for 6 weeks after a heart attack, 6 weeks, the exact Mitchell dosage, applied to a different organ on the same instinct, are now up and moving within days, because the 6 weeks of stillness turned out to be killing people. The research that established all this has a strange poetic footnote. Some of the most important bed rest studies were run by NASA, which needed to understand what prolonged immobility does to healthy bodies in order to understand spaceflight, and which found that weeks of enforced lying down measurably degrades even a superbly fit human. Muscle, bone, heart, mood, all of it. The healthiest people on Earth, put through a version of Mitchell's cure in the name of science, came out the other end resembling his patients. The instrument was never neutral. The bed was never nothing. It took 100 years and a space program to prove, with numbers, what a woman in a yellow-papered room had reported in 1892 for the price of a magazine story. That enforced stillness is not the absence of an intervention. It is one of the most powerful interventions there is. Aim it at the wrong target, and it does not merely fail to heal. It becomes the illness with a schedule. Before we return to Charlotte Perkins Gilman for the last time, let's sit for a while with the question this whole night has been quietly building toward. The one about the gap between what a treatment does and what it is for. Because the rest cure, examined closely, was doing several different things at once, and separating them is the most useful thing we can carry out of this room. The first thing it did was feed and rest genuinely depleted bodies. That part was real. Some fraction of Mitchell's patients arrived malnourished, anemic, sleepless to the point of physical crisis, and 8 weeks of food and sleep is, for that condition, actual medicine in any century. When historians go looking for why the rest cure held its reputation for 40 years, this is a large part of the answer. It contained, buried inside the theory and the control, a core of real physiological help for a subset of patients. The successes were not all imaginary. Treatments that are entirely useless die faster than this one did. It is the partially useful ones, the ones that work sometimes, for some people, for reasons other than the stated theory, that live for generations, because every success feeds the legend, and every failure can be blamed on the patient. The second thing it did was provide, for some women, the only socially acceptable exit from an unbearable situation. This is one of the stranger findings when you read the era closely. There were patients who, in some complicated way, needed the rest cure. Not the milk or the massage, but the diagnosis. Illness was the one door out of the parlor that no one could argue with. A woman could not say, "I cannot bear this life." That sentence had no legitimate speaker in 1885. But my nerves have collapsed. That sentence worked. It summoned doctors instead of judgment. It suspended, at least temporarily, every duty. The household, the entertaining, the conjugal obligations that the era did not discuss, and the physicians carefully did not ask about. Some historians of medicine have argued, persuasively, that a portion of Victorian nervous illness functioned as a strike, the only form of refusal available, conducted in the only language the culture would accept, which was the language of symptoms. The body said what the woman was not permitted to, and the rest cure, read this way, was the negotiation, the culture agreeing to give her a sanctioned pause, on the strict condition that the pause be medicalized, supervised, and temporary, and that she come back afterward and resume. The third thing it did, and this is the one the era could not see, because seeing it would have required questioning the room instead of the patient, was enforce. Whatever else the rest cure was, it was also a technology for returning deviating women to the standard configuration, not out of cruelty, out of sincere belief that the standard configuration was health. That is the part that should stay with you, because it is the transferable part. Mitchell did not think he was suppressing anyone. He thought contented domesticity simply was what a well woman looked like, the way a physician today knows what a healthy heart rhythm looks like, and so any treatment that produced it was, by definition, working. The values were upstream of the evidence. They always are. The doctor never sees them, because he is standing on them. And so the question the rest cure hands to every era that studies it, the question we flagged earlier, and can now ask with its full weight, is not were they foolish then? They were not foolish. Mitchell was one of the finest clinical observers of his century. The question is, what are our versions? Where, right now, is suffering being treated as a malfunction of the person when it is actually accurate information about the person's situation? Every age has conditions it medicates because it cannot afford to hear them, diagnoses that quietly do the work of keeping arrangements intact, treatments whose real endpoint is not the patient's flourishing, but the patient's return to function defined, always, by whoever is not in the bed. We will not answer that tonight. It is 2 in the morning, and the answer belongs to the historians of the 22nd century, who will see our consulting rooms the way we see Mitchell's, clearly, effortlessly, and far too late to warn anyone. The gap does not close, it moves. What we can do, the only thing anyone in the middle of a century can do, is keep the pencils within reach. Because the one reliable instrument this whole story validated, the one technology that outperformed the milk and the electricity and the eminent men, was the patient's own account, written down and kept. The daybook recorded the pulse, the pencil recorded the truth, and 130 years later, it is the pencil we are still reading. The cure crossed the Atlantic, of course. Confident treatments always do, and its English career adds a few shades to the picture worth pausing over before we return to the man who invented it. Mitchell's system arrived in Britain in the 1880s and was taken up with enthusiasm by the London nerve specialists, most prominently William Smolt Playfair, an obstetric physician who became its chief English advocate and administered it, with local adjustments, to the nervous women of the British upper classes. The adjustments are themselves revealing. English practice, operating in a culture even more elaborately stratified than Philadelphia's, leaned harder on the seclusion, the removal of the patient, not just from family, but from class context, into nursing homes in Mayfair and spa towns where the treatment could be conducted with hotel discretion. The English medical journals debated the cure for years in the courteous knife-fight register of Victorian professional correspondence, enthusiasts reporting series of grateful recoveries, skeptics observing dryly that a treatment requiring 2 months, 3 specialists, and a small fortune had somehow never been found necessary for the nervous ailments of factory women, who were presumably possessed of the same nervous systems. That observation, printed in the era's own journals, in the era's own voice, deserves a moment of respect. The Victorians were not uniformly blind to what the rest cure was. Some of them saw it with perfect clarity and said so in public, and were outweighed. The historical record is not a record of universal delusion. It is a record, as it almost always is, of a minority report filed on time and adopted late. The same shape we found in the story of the radium water, and the story of the tranquilizers, and every other story this channel seems to keep telling, because it is, underneath the costumes, largely the same story. And in the English version too, the patients wrote back. The novelist and actress Elizabeth Robbins left an account of her treatment. Vernon Lee sharpened essays against the nerve doctors, and decades of English fiction quietly absorbed the sickroom and the resting woman as furniture of the age, so thoroughly that by the time Woolf put Sir William Bradshaw on the page, her readers did not need the institution explained. Everyone knew someone. Everyone had tiptoed past a door. We have spent the whole night, so far, looking at Silas Weir Mitchell from the outside. The fees, the system, the verdicts. Fairness requires that we now spend a little while looking at the man himself, because he is a far stranger and more divided figure than the villain's silhouette he sometimes gets reduced to, and the divisions in him are, in their own way, the most instructive thing about him. Begin with this. Mitchell was a writer, not a doctor who dabbled, a serious, prolific, commercially successful novelist and poet. He published 19 novels, historical fiction mostly, and psychological studies of character. His novel Hugh Wynne, about a Quaker in the American Revolution, was a genuine bestseller in 1897. He wrote poetry his whole life, and privately measured himself against the real poets, and ached, his letters show it, over the suspicion that literature took him less seriously than medicine did. He corresponded with writers, collected writers, dined with writers. Walt Whitman, whom he treated and quietly helped support financially for years, called him a good deal more than a doctor. Now hold that fact next to the prescription he gave Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the most literary physician in America, a man who spent his own evenings at exactly the work of pen and paper, who by his own testimony found in writing the deepest satisfaction of his life, looked at a young woman burning with the same vocation, and ordered her, as medicine, never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as she lived. He prescribed against her the very thing he lived by, and there is no evidence he ever registered the contradiction. The battery theory did his thinking for him. In a man of his constitution, writing was expression. In a woman of hers, it was expenditure. The same act, passing through the theory, came out as opposite substances. If you want a single image of how a framework can blind a brilliant man, it is that one. Not stupidity, not malice. A theory, sitting between an intelligent observer and the evidence, sorting everything into the boxes it arrived with. The era, it should be said, told stories about Mitchell, and the stories were part of the treatment. His authority was theatrical, and he cultivated it, and the profession passed around anecdotes of the great man's nerve like relics. The most famous one, printed in reminiscences after his death, possibly polished in the retelling, possibly outright legend, and historians flag it as unverifiable, so take it as the era's mythology rather than the era's record, concerned a patient who would not get out of bed after her cure was complete. Persuasion failed. Warnings failed. Mitchell, the story goes, finally announced that if she would not rise, he would get into the bed with her, and began, with perfect calm, to remove his coat. The lady was reportedly on her feet before he reached his waistcoat. The profession loved that story. It was told admiringly, as evidence of his mastery of the nervous temperament. Listen to it now, and you hear something else. A system in which the physician's willingness to overwhelm the patient, charmingly, theatrically, but absolutely, was not the scandal, it was the skill. And yet, the dividedness again, this same man could be, by many patients' own grateful testimony, a genuinely healing presence. The archives hold the other letters too, women who credited him with saving their lives, who described being truly heard for the first time, who returned to him for decades. Part of this was the food and the rest, reaching genuinely starved bodies. Part of it was something simpler and almost embarrassing for the theory. He paid attention. In an era when a woman's complaints were routinely waved off in 10 distracted minutes, Mitchell's initial consultations were long, detailed, and serious. He took histories, he asked. The tragedy, and it is the precise, technical tragedy of this whole story, is what happened to all that carefully gathered attention. It went into the machine of the theory, and the machine returned the same output almost every time. He listened better than his colleagues, and then prescribed what the listening should have argued against. The attention was real, it just was not allowed to change the answer. He knew doubt, too, at the edges. Late in his career, in addresses to younger physicians, Mitchell conceded that the profession understood far less about these conditions than its confidence implied, and that the rest cure demanded judgment and could be, his own word, misused in unskilled hands. It is not repentance. He never repudiated the system, and he went to his grave its author. But it is a crack, and cracks matter in this story, because the official literature had so few of them, because there were critics, inside the profession, in real time, and they deserve their moment tonight, since the easiest false comfort history offers is the idea that nobody could have known better. Some knew better. There were physicians, including some of the first generation of women physicians, who looked at the rest cure and said versions of exactly what we have been saying all night. Mary Putnam Jacobi, one of the most rigorously scientific physicians in America, a woman who had fought her way through the Paris medical schools, argued that inactivity itself was harmful to nervous patients, and that what many of these women needed was more to do and more to be, not less, she prescribed, against the current, engagement, muscular exercise, and purpose. In Britain, a fierce medical debate ran for years in the journals about the wholesale confinement of women on nervous grounds. The dissent existed. It was published. It was, on the whole, politely absorbed and out-prestiged. Mitchell's reputation was a weather system, and contrary findings tended to dissolve somewhere inside it. Which is its own permanent lesson, and not only about the 19th century. Being right is not the same as being heard, and the volume of a truth has historically had less to do with its evidence than with the eminence of the person declining to believe it. And one more patient now, briefly, because her afterlife makes the perfect counterweight to close this gallery. In the 1880s, a young woman from Illinois named Jane Addams, college-educated, brilliant, and utterly becalmed in the way of educated daughters with nowhere to put themselves, collapsed into invalidism and was treated by none other than Weir Mitchell himself with the standard apparatus. It did not cure her. By her own account, the years of prescribed rest and aimless convalescent travel deepened the paralysis. She called that period the snare of preparation, a life endlessly readied and never begun. What cured her, she said, was the opposite of the prescription: work. In 1889, she moved into a rundown mansion in the immigrant slums of Chicago and founded Hull House, and the becalmed invalid became arguably the most consequential social reformer in American history, and, in 1931, a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. Her own diagnosis of her own case, written years later, was clinical and devastating. What she and the young women like her had been suffering from was not depleted nerve force. It was the absence of any avenue for their abilities. The disease was the doing of nothing. The cure had prescribed more of the disease. Gilman found the pencil. Addams found the door. Roosevelt was handed the horizon. Alice James, who was permitted none of the three, made the record anyway. Line those 4 recoveries and non-recoveries up side by side, and the entire theory falls over from a single push. In every case, what healed, where healing came at all, was not rest. It was purpose, restored or seized. The battery was never empty. It was disconnected. Let's slow down now and take one long, quiet walk through the material culture of all this. The objects, the rooms, the stuff. Because we are deep in the night now, and the deep of the night is for inventories, and the rest, cure left behind a very particular inventory. Start with the milk. 2 quarts a day, at the peak of the strict phase. 8 glasses, every 2 hours, around the clock's waking span. The milk of 1887 was not the milk in your refrigerator. Pasteurization existed but was decades from universal. The milk arriving at a respectable Philadelphia door came from a dairy on the city's edge, or a farm beyond it, carried in cans on a cart, ladled or bottled, its safety resting largely on the dairyman's honesty and the weather. Physicians of the era knew perfectly well that bad milk killed. The infant mortality statistics said so every summer, which is why the milk for a rest cure patient was specified, sourced and fussed over like a medication, which, in the theory, it was. It would be boiled or scalded in the kitchen, cooled to the prescribed warmth, carried up. There are surviving instructions in the nursing manuals of the period on exactly this. The temperature, the small quantities, the 2-hour intervals, the keeping of the milk record. A document, somewhere in an archive right now, that is nothing but a ruled page recording every glass of milk a grown woman drank in the autumn of 1888. History keeps strange receipts. The bed itself was an instrument, and the manuals treated it as one. A firm hair mattress, not feathers. Feathers overheated the patient and let her sink, and sinking was somehow morally as well as posturally suspect. The pillows arranged just so, the rubber sheet beneath the linen for the washing days, the bed positioned out of drafts, but within the nurse's sightline from the adjoining room. Some practitioners specified the bed's orientation in the room. Everything specified. If you have ever wondered what Victorian medicine did with all the confidence it could not spend on actual cures, the answer is specifications. The less certain the science, the more elaborate the protocol. That equation did not retire with the century either. The massage came with its own apparatus, the oils, the flannels, the trained hands billing by the hour, and the electricity came with a genuine machine, a Faraday battery in a polished wooden box, coils and cylinders and cloth-covered cords, carried into the bedroom like a small, important piece of luggage. The current was mild, the ritual was not. The electrodes placed, the crank turned or the cell connected, the muscles jumping obediently under the skin while the patient lay still. Modern life administered in its purest form, electricity itself. The very force Beard said was draining the nation, now piped back into the depleted body in scheduled doses. Nobody at the bedside seems to have found this funny. It is all right if you do. The century cannot hear us. And the wallpaper. Since we keep returning to it, let's actually look at it. The dense, over-patterned wallpapers of the era were not incidental set dressing. They were the height of taste, and they were everywhere. And a confined person had no choice but an intimate relationship with them. William Morris's intricate botanical designs were the aspiration. Cheaper printers flooded the market with busier, muddier imitations, sprawling florals, interlocking scrolls, patterns that repeated but never quite resolved. Gilman chose her setting with a writer's precision, a pattern committed to no laws of design, she called it, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study. Anyone who has lain ill in a room facing a patterned wall knows the phenomenon she weaponized. The eye, unemployed, starts working the pattern like a puzzle, finding faces, finding figures, finding movement. The Victorians even had anxieties about wallpaper's effect on the nerves, and, in a detail that belongs in this story's collection of ironies, some of those green wallpapers really were poisoning people, through the arsenic in the pigments. The walls of the healing room, in more ways than one, were never neutral. Even the sounds of the cure had a texture worth preserving. The house's daytime hush, enforced downstairs on the patient's behalf, the 2-hour rhythm of the stairs. The clock, there was always a clock, whose ticking several memoirists mention with feeling, because when everything else is subtracted from a day, the clock becomes the day. The street sounds through the shutters, hooves, the rag-and-bone man, children released from school at 3, the lamplighter at dusk if the neighborhood still had gas. An entire world arriving as audio only, like a voice in a dark room telling you about things far away, while you lie still with your eyes closed. I did not plan that symmetry, but I am not going to pretend it isn't there. The difference, and it is the entire difference, the one this whole night has been about, is the door. Yours is open. You chose the voice. You chose the dark, and you can leave both whenever you like. Stillness that you choose is rest. Stillness that is chosen for you is something else, wearing rest's clothing. The Victorians owned every object in the inventory we just walked through. The milk, the firm mattress, the quiet room, the patterned walls, and the objects were never the problem. The problem was one missing item, small enough to fit in a pocket, and they kept it downstairs on purpose. A key, on the inside of the door. One more chapter of the story remains before we close, and it belongs to the patients we can never name, because for every Gilman and every Alice James who left a record, there were thousands of women who left only entries in other people's books. And the archives, read carefully, Let us reconstruct at least the shape of their experience, even where the voices are gone. The historians who have gone through the case records, Mitchell's own surviving files, the sanitarium registers, the correspondence between physicians and families, have assembled a composite that is worth carrying. The typical rest-cure patient of the 1880s and 90s was married, between 25 and 45, from a family of means. Her collapse followed, with striking regularity, one of a small set of life events: a birth, a bereavement, the marriage of a last daughter, a household relocation, the arrival in the home of an aging parent, which is to say, the standard load-bearing moments of a Victorian woman's existence, the points where the structure pressed down hardest. The records note her symptoms in the era's vocabulary. They note her weight faithfully, week by week, because weight was the number the theory could see. And then, in the great majority of files, the record simply ends. Discharged improved, the pages say, or discharged much improved, and the woman walks out of the document and back into a life about which the file has nothing further to report. Discharged improved. 2 words, closing thousands of stories. And the honest historian's confession, which will be ours too, is that we mostly cannot know what happened next. Some genuinely were improved, rested, fed, steadied, and returned to lives that, whatever their constraints, they went on to inhabit with reasonable contentment. It would be its own distortion to conscript every Victorian patient into a story of suppressed rebellion. People are various. Some found in the diagnosis, as we said, a workable truce with their circumstances, and renewed the truce periodically for years. The records show repeat patients, women who returned for a rest cure the way their husbands returned to the spa town, and it is not for us, at this distance, to rule on what mixture of illness, strategy, and habit each return contained. And some, the letters between physicians occasionally let this slip, cycled through cure after cure, improving and relapsing and improving, for decades, because the cure kept treating the tiredness, and the life kept manufacturing more of it, and neither party to the arrangement ever named the manufacturer. There is one category of evidence, though, that speaks louder than the files, and it is this: the daughters. The generation of women who watched their mothers take the rest cure, who were children in the hushed downstairs of those houses, who were shushed on the stairs and told Mama is resting, grew up to be the generation that dismantled the entire framework. They became the first mass cohort of college women, the suffrage organizers, the settlement house workers, the first women physicians in real numbers, the writers of the 1910s and 20s who put the Victorian sickroom into fiction as a horror setting, which is where it has remained ever since. The rest cure, among everything else it did, ran a 40-year live demonstration in thousands of respectable homes of exactly what the culture proposed to do with a woman's unspent capabilities, and the audience for that demonstration was the next generation, watching from the hallway. It is not the smallest reason the framework fell. Few arguments against a system are as effective as a childhood spent tiptoeing past its results. And this, finally, is why the story belongs on a sleep channel at all, why it is not simply a horror told in a soothing voice, which would be a cheap trick, and you would be right to resent it. The rest cure failed because it confused two things that look identical from the outside and are opposites from the inside: rest and stillness. Stillness is a posture. Rest is a relationship between a person and their own life, their own purposes, their own door. The Victorians perfected the posture and called it the relationship, and the whole magnificent apparatus, the milk, the specifications, the 4 minutes of sunlight, was a century-long demonstration that you cannot administer rest to someone whose life is the thing they need rest from. Real rest requires that the life be worth returning to, or at least be yours to change. That is why Roosevelt could rest in a saddle at 14 hours a day, and Gilman could not rest in a bed at 0. The dosage was never the variable, the ownership was. You, meanwhile, are conducting the experiment correctly. It is late, the room is dark, the voice is optional, and everything you set down tonight, the day, the inbox, the arithmetic of your own life, is sitting exactly where you left it, and it is yours, and it will keep until morning. Nobody is recording your pulse. Nobody is grading your stillness. This is what the whole apparatus was trying to manufacture, and never could, because it cannot be manufactured, only permitted. Permission granted, then, from nobody, which is the only authority that was ever real. And now the ending of the rest cures era can be told properly, because it was not only that the treatment was discredited, it was that it was replaced, and what replaced it was, in the most literal sense imaginable, its exact opposite. The 19th century's answer to nervous suffering was to silence the patient. The 20th century's answer, arriving out of Vienna in the very same years Mitchell's reputation was cresting, was to ask the patient to speak, and then to do something the entire apparatus of the rest cure had been engineered to avoid. Listen to the answer as if it contained the diagnosis. The origin story of that reversal has a detail in it that fits tonight's theme so precisely it is almost suspicious. In the early 1880s, a Viennese physician named Josef Breuer was treating a young woman the case histories call Anna O. Her real name was Bertha Pappenheim, and she deserves her real name because she was, like the other women in tonight's story, considerably more than a case. She was brilliant, multilingual, ferociously intelligent, and confined by illness and circumstance in ways that will sound familiar by now. And in the course of her treatment, she discovered, the patient, not the physician, that when she was permitted to talk through the material pressing on her mind, tracing symptoms back to their origins in words, the symptoms loosened. She gave the method its name herself. She called it, in English, the talking cure. Breuer wrote it down. His younger colleague Sigmund Freud picked it up, built upon it, and the entire edifice of 20th century psychotherapy, whatever one makes of its later architecture, stands on that foundation. A woman in a room, saying what she actually meant, to someone who had decided her words were data rather than symptoms. Set the two prescriptions side by side, because history rarely offers so clean a contrast. Philadelphia, 1887. Never touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as you live. Vienna, the same decade. Say everything. The saying is the treatment. One system treated the patient's inner life as the leak that had drained the battery. The other treated it as the only room where the answer had ever been. And it matters. It matters enormously for the shape of this whole night. That the second system's founding insight came from a patient, named the method herself, and that Bertha Pappenheim went on, once she was free of her own long convalescence, to become one of the great social reformers of Europe, a fighter for women's rights, a founder of institutions, an organizer on a Jane Addams scale. The pattern holds one more time, in a different country, in a different language. The recovery ran through purpose. The purpose ran through a voice. The voice had been the thing prescribed against. None of this means the talking cure century got everything right. It assembled its own confident errors, some of them at women's expense too, and the historians of that story are still filing their reports. Every framework is a lantern. It lights some of the room and deepens the shadows in the rest, and the people holding it can never quite see which is which. That was true of Beard's battery, true of Mitchell's bed, true of the couch that replaced the bed, and it is, This is the only safe bet in the entire history of medicine, true of whatever we are holding now. But the direction of travel, across that turn of the century, was real, and it can be stated in one line. Medicine went from putting its hand over the patient's mouth to putting its ear beside it, imperfectly, unevenly, with relapses that continue to this day. But the line moved, and it moved because the people on the wrong side of it kept producing testimony the framework could not digest. The short story, the diary, the novel, the named method, the founded institution, until the framework, rather than the patients, was the thing that finally had to be discharged. There is a last scene from Mitchell's own life that belongs here, and then we can let him go. In 1908, near the end of everything, the old man addressed the American Neurological Association, the organization he had helped found, on the subject of his career. He was 79, the talking cure was rising, his century was setting, the audience was full of younger men who honored him as a monument, which is the politest thing a profession can call the past. And in that address, and in other late writings, Mitchell did something that his fiercest critics rarely get around to mentioning. He wondered, out loud, in public, how much of what his generation had believed would survive. He told the young men that half of what they had been taught was wrong, and that the difficulty was that no one knew which half. He meant it generally. He could not, of course, apply it specifically. No one ever can. That is the whole tragedy of the lantern. But he said it, and it was true, and it is still true, and it will be said again by some eminent, confident, sincerely mistaken authority in a hall full of the people who will spend their careers finding out which half. He died 6 years later, in the first winter of the World War, the event that would, among its innumerable other demolitions, finish Neurasthenia for good, because the trenches produced nervous collapse on a scale no battery theory could survive, in hundreds of thousands of young men whose nerve force had been depleted by nothing except the 20th century itself. The war gave the collapse a new name, shell shock, and gave medicine a new, harder, longer argument about what suffering is and whose account of it counts. But that is another night's story. For this one, the accounts are closed. The doctor has given his last address. The patients have filed their reports. And the reports won. And since we are deep in the small hours ourselves now, one last set of rooms, the quietest ones, the nights of the cure. Because the daybooks, as we said, stopped at 8 o'clock. And what happened after 8 is the part of this history that belongs most naturally to the people listening to it in the dark. The nights were long. The gas was turned down or out. The nurse's breathing settled in the next room, and the patient lay in the deepest silence the 19th century could purchase, a silence with money in it, upholstered, complete. Some of the women, in the letters and memoirs, describe those nights as the only part of the cure that ever actually belonged to them. No feedings, no measurements, no performance of progress for anyone, just the ceiling, the faint geometry of the shutters, and a mind finally left alone with itself, which was, depending on the night and the woman, either the treatment's one mercy or its purest form. One patient wrote afterward that she used the nights to travel. She would close her eyes and walk, room by room, through every house she had ever lived in, her grandmother's kitchen, the school corridor, the garden of her first married home, checking the details, opening the drawers, a whole estate of memory that no prescription could enter. Another composed music she had no way to write down. Another simply counted her own pulse against the clock, night after night, keeping, without ever calling it that, her own daybook, in the only ink available, which was attention. That is the image to keep, I think, as this history closes. Not the famous doctor, and not even the famous story, but the unrecorded hours between 8 and 6, thousands of nights, in hundreds of respectable houses, where the treatment's whole machinery stood down and the patients did, unsupervised, the one thing the theory said would drain them, they thought. They remembered. They planned and imagined and composed. And the batteries, night after night, failed to empty. Morning after morning, the women were still there, fuller, if anything, than the schedule had left them. The evidence against the entire framework was being generated nightly, in the dark, in every room the cure occupied. It just took the daylight 40 years to admit it. There is a coda to Gilman's story that we skipped past earlier, and it belongs here, before the last scene, because her life after the pencil is its own answer to the theory, written out over 4 more decades. After California, after the divorce that scandalized 2 coasts, and it did scandalize, the newspapers followed it, and her decision to send her daughter to live with her ex-husband and his new wife, whom Gilman herself had introduced and remained close to, was treated as something close to a crime against nature. She built exactly the life the prescription had forbidden. She lectured across the country, and then across the Atlantic, on economics, on labor, on the design of homes and cities. Women and Economics, in 1898, made her internationally famous. It argued that the whole domestic arrangement, the woman maintained in the house, her work unpaid and invisible, was not nature but economics, and changeable, as economics always is. She wrote utopian novels imagining societies organized otherwise. Herland, in 1915, invented a country of women engineers and foresters, and mothers who had never been told what they were for, and let 3 American men wander into it and slowly discover that everything they knew was a local custom. And she filled The Forerunner, that one-woman magazine, for 7 straight years. She calculated the total output herself, with a writer's grim satisfaction at the equivalent of 28 full-length books. 28 books, from the woman prescribed 2 hours of intellectual life a day. If the nerve force theory had been true, that output would have killed her several times over. It did not kill her. By every account, including her own, it was the thing that kept her alive. Her energy was not bottomless, and her life was not a triumphant straight line. She struggled with depression in waves for the rest of her days, and she was a person of her era in other ways too, holding views on race that her modern readers rightly flinch at. She goes into history as she was, not as we would tidy her. But on the one question tonight has been asking, what actually heals a mind that a century has diagnosed as overdrawn? Her whole remaining life stands as a single extended data point, and the data point says, work, meaning, the pen, daily, until the end. At the very end, dying of cancer in 1935, at 75, she made her final decision with the same authorship she had claimed at 26, choosing the time of her own death and leaving a note that explained her reasoning as calmly as an essay. However one regards that choice, it was, unmistakably, hers. The last entry in a life that had been, since the day she set aside the famous prescription, entirely self-written. The woman whom medicine had ordered to become a body without an author died as she had lived for 50 years. The author of the body. Before we close, let's return one more time to a bedroom, a different one, some years later, because there is one more scene this story owes you. It is 1913, in California. Charlotte Perkins Gilman is 53 years old. She is, by now, one of the most famous women in America, a lecturer who fills halls, the author of Women and Economics, a book translated into 7 languages that argued, decades ahead of its moment, that women's dependence was economic before it was anything else. She writes constantly. She publishes a magazine, The Forerunner, which she fills entirely by herself. Every article, every issue, month after month, a one-woman rebuttal, tens of thousands of words a year, to a prescription that once allotted her 2 hours of intellectual life a day. And in 1913, she sits down and writes a short essay with a plain title, Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper. It is barely a page long. In it, she tells the story we have told tonight. The breakdown, the famous specialist, the rest cure, the instruction never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again, and the near ruin that followed obedience. She describes casting the prescription aside and going back to work. And she ends with the sentence about Mitchell changing his methods, and the line that has outlived everyone involved. It was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy. And it worked. The essay is the quietest possible form of victory. No triumph, no bitterness. Just a patient, 26 years later, filing the final report on her own case. The doctor had the theory, the fees, the reputation, and the locked door. The patient had a pencil. The pencil won. So here you are, at the end of a long evening in the age of the rest cure. You have lain in the dim room on the second floor in Philadelphia and drunk the milk and learned the ceiling by heart. You have met Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, brilliant, certain, celebrated, and wrong in the one place it mattered most. You have watched the same diagnosis split at the doorway of the consulting room, the men riding out toward the Badlands with notebooks in their saddlebags, the women climbing the stairs toward the quiet room. You have read, over a fictional narrator's shoulder, the pattern in the yellow wallpaper, and watched a woman tear it down in sheets. You have followed the whole apparatus, the theory, the fees, the milk cart, the drawn curtains, up to the moment history quietly reversed the verdict and moved on. The women who were sent to those rooms were not weak, and they were not mad. They were, in case after documented case, capable and intelligent people having an entirely proportionate response to lives that had been built too small for them. And they were handed a treatment that made the lives smaller still, administered by people who sincerely believed they were helping. Most of them endured it. Some were genuinely restored by the food and the sleep, whatever the theory said. Some were damaged, and a few, the ones with pencils, got the last word, which is why tonight exists at all. And the pattern they exposed did not retire with the treatment. Every era, including this one, has conditions it cannot quite see, because the diagnosis would indict the way things are arranged. Every era prefers to treat the patient rather than the room. The rest cure is easy to see now because its costume is old. The question it leaves behind is not about Victorian medicine at all. It is about what we are currently prescribing stillness for. That is actually a problem with the walls. But that is a question for the morning, and the morning is a long way off. Sleep well. The curtains are drawn, but you drew them yourself, because you wanted them drawn. The room is quiet, but the door is not locked, and the book on your nightstand is yours to open or ignore, and no one is coming at 4 o'clock to take your pulse and decide how you are doing. You get to decide how you are doing. Somewhere, 130 years back, a woman in a dim room is tracing the pattern on the wallpaper and beginning, very quietly, to compose sentences in her head. Because they cannot take the sentences you make in your head. That was the one thing they could never take. And one day soon she is going to get out of that bed and find a pencil. She does get out. She finds the pencil. Rest now. You have nothing to prove to anyone tonight.